She gave free soup to the lonely old woman every night at the small diner on the corner. Just an act of kindness, nothing more. But one night, a Mafia boss walked in with 4 men in black suits, silent as shadows. He dropped an old photograph on the counter. It was the old woman, younger, beautiful, and elegant. "That's my mother," he said, his voice cold as steel. "She was supposed to be dead long ago." Gracie Miller, a middle-aged waitress living alone, had no idea that the woman she had quietly protected for 3 months held secrets powerful enough to bring down an empire, and that her small kindness was about to drag her into a world from which there was no way back. Gracie worked at Gracie's Diner, an aging eatery on the corner of Flatbush, Brooklyn, where autumn rain often poured down like grief, and the neon sign flickered and died like a tired breath. The diner was nearly empty at night, just a few taxi drivers, night guards, and the old woman, Miss Ellie, as Gracie called her, had no known name. She came every night, as punctual as an old clock, sitting at the last table by the window, watching the rain as if counting the fragments of a past that had long dissolved into the wind. Gracie never asked much. She just brought her a bowl of hot chicken soup and a cup of black coffee, free of charge. "Call it a trade for a sad song," she'd say with a smile, because Miss Ellie often hummed an old Italian tune Gracie had never heard anywhere else but at that table. That night began like any other. Rain fell heavily, soaking into the silver strands of Gracie's hair as she locked the front door after the first shift, changed into her night uniform, and reheated the pot of bone broth chicken soup. Miss Ellie was already in her usual seat, her frail hands cupping the mug as if it was the only warmth left in the world. Gracie didn't think much of it. She just felt that somewhere within this monotonous, lonely life, there existed a connection that needed no words. "Gracie, you're too kind to an old woman who's no good to anyone," Miss Ellie said, eyes still lost in the rain. "Not everyone has to be useful to deserve kindness," Gracie replied, placing an extra slice of toast on the plate. Near midnight, when only the two of them remained, the door swung open. A gust of cold wind swept in along with 5 figures. Gracie looked up, the coffee pot still in her hand. 5 men walked in, rain glistening on their tailored coats, shoes polished like mirrors. Not regulars, not the kind of people who belonged in the quiet world of night shifts. The man in the center was tall, with salt and pepper hair combed neatly like he was heading into a boardroom, yet his eyes were colder than judgment itself. He didn't need to introduce himself. His presence froze the air. Gracie set the coffee pot down. "We're about to close," she said softly. The man didn't respond. He reached into his coat, pulled out a faded photograph, and laid it on the counter like an accusation. Gracie looked down. The woman in the photo was beautiful hair pinned up, pearls around her neck, standing before a grand mansion. Her eyes glimmered with both pride and sorrow. "Have you seen this woman?" the man asked, his voice gravelly, as if scraped raw by years of pain. Gracie started to shake her head, but then she looked closer and her breath caught. Those eyes, that faint smile, the curve of her cheek, it was Miss Ellie, the woman sitting at the corner table, only 40 years younger. I'm not sure," Gracie whispered. The man nodded slightly, as though confirming a suspicion that had haunted him for years. "She's my mother," he said, "and she was declared dead, 23 years ago." No one spoke, only the rain against the window, and the sound of Gracie's heartbeat cracking. She had served free soup to a nameless, lonely woman. But now she realized she had just poured another cup of coffee for a ghost a mother buried alive in the past, and a secret that could destroy anyone who dared touch it. If you're still here with Gracie, perhaps you too can feel the cold rain seeping through the diner's old glass windows on Flatbush, where one small act of kindness has opened a door to a past buried for 23 years. And now, that past has returned in the form of the man named Russo. Please subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video to hear more emotional stories where kindness becomes the faint light that pierces the dark. And where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment with your city or country below, so we'll know that Gracie and Miss Ellie's story has found you wherever you are in the world. Gracie stood frozen behind the counter, her hand resting on the now cold coffee pot. The photo lay between them like a pulse of dread. The man Vincent Russo didn't need to say his name. His gaze, his posture, and the way the 4 men behind him stood like statues were enough. He wasn't an ordinary man, not a passerby seeking a midnight meal, not a son searching for his mother out of love. He was something else, like a storm that had waited too long in silence, now breaking loose upon the diner as mercilessly as the Brooklyn rain outside. Vincent said nothing more. His eyes swept the small room, stopping at the corner table where the woman in the photo had always sat. But now, the chair was empty. The coffee cup still steamed faintly. The silver spoon leaned against the half-finished bowl of soup. Gracie turned instinctively. She had been there, just moments ago. Impossible. Vincent moved swiftly to the table, lifting the cup, studying the steam as though it could tell him time. "She just left," he murmured, his tone low but commanding. One of the men behind him pulled out a phone, muttering rapidly in Italian. Two others dispersed silently, prying open the doors behind the kitchen, even the refrigerator, as if the old woman might be hiding among the pots and pans. Gracie snapped out of her daze, stepping forward with a dish towel clutched in her hand, a useless reflex of protection. "You can't do that," she said, her voice trembling. "This is a business. We're closing. I have the right." Vincent turned, and with a single glance, silenced her. "Where is she?" Gracie opened her mouth, but her throat felt dry as paper. She couldn't answer. She didn't want to betray the trust of the woman who had shared so many quiet nights over soup and rain. But before she could think of a lie, Vincent gave a signal. One man stepped forward, set a small black briefcase on the counter with a heavy thud. "We'll find her with or without your help," Vincent said, his tone even, almost calm. "But if you're hiding something, I'd advise you to consider the consequences." Gracie's fingers dug into the towel until her nails left marks on her skin. She thought of Ellie, of the way she cradled her cup as if it were a secret, of her faraway gaze while humming those strange Italian tunes. She thought of the past 3 months, the cold nights, and the strange comfort of having another soul breathing quietly across the room. "I don't know who she is," Gracie said finally, her voice steady. "Just an old customer, a lonely woman." Vincent didn't reply. He lifted the photograph, tucked it back into his coat, and glanced once more at the table, the spoon, the soup, the fading steam. "She died 23 years ago," he murmured, barely loud enough for Gracie to hear. "But I know I'm not crazy." Then he turned, motioned to his men. The door opened again. The wind rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and cigarette smoke from their coats. Outside, a long black car waited by the curb, its yellow headlights cutting through the drizzle. When Vincent stepped inside, he looked back once through the glass. This time, his eyes weren't those of a threat but of a boy who had lost something long ago and had just seen its ghost again. The car pulled away, its taillights dissolving into the storm. Only Gracie remained, standing in the empty diner, the towel still in her hand, the chair by the window still empty. Her heart pounded, but within it echoed only one thought. Ellie was gone. No word, no trace. And now Gracie knew she had stepped into a story that no longer belonged to the world of ordinary people. The rain outside kept falling without pause, steady as the beat of Gracie's heart, only colder, more relentless. She stood in the middle of her own diner, a place that had once felt safe and familiar now invaded, defiled. Wet shoe prints stained the tile floor, cigarette smoke lingered with the damp scent of rain, and beneath it all, the faint metallic tang of fear still clung to the air. Yet what left her most shaken wasn't the 5 strangers who had appeared from the storm, nor the black briefcase that had landed on her counter like a threat. It was Vincent Russo's words. "That's my mother." 6 simple syllables that tore apart everything Gracie had ever believed about the woman she called Miss Ellie. She was not merely a lonely old woman, homeless and forgotten, in need of soup and a sliver of warmth on cold nights. She was the center of a secret buried for more than 2 decades, a mother who had vanished from her son's life, leaving behind a wound that had never healed. Someone who had once been the wife of a man so powerful that his name alone could silence an entire block. Gracie sank onto the stool by the counter, her body too weak to stand. Her eyes drifted toward the corner table where Ellie had always sat now, empty, cold. The napkin still folded neatly on the tabletop. A faint coffee stain spread like dried blood. She was gone. Not because the soup was finished, not because she wished to leave early. She had seen him. She had seen Vincent walk in, and in that single moment between the sound of rain and the frost in her son's eyes, she had chosen to disappear from the only refuge she had left. Gracie rose quietly and walked toward the back door. She pushed open the old wooden door leading to the narrow alley behind the diner, where trash bins lined the wall and water dripped endlessly from a rusted pipe. Outside, there was no one. No footsteps, no trace. Only the thick curtain of rain and a gray wool scarf draped over the edge of a trash can, soaked through. Gracie picked it up with trembling hands. It was Ellie's. Soft, worn, frayed at one corner from years of use. She had left in a hurry, too fast to take it with her. Or perhaps she had meant to leave it, a sign for Gracie that she hadn't gone far, or that she knew she never would return. Gracie stepped back inside, bolted the door, and sank into a chair like someone lost inside her own home. Questions clawed at her mind. Why would Eleanor Russo, the mother of a mafia boss, come to this diner every night, sitting quietly among cab drivers and night workers, wearing an old coat and eyes filled with sorrow? Why would she fake her own death, flee from her family, from a son so powerful even Brooklyn bent to his shadow? And most of all, why here? Why Gracie? She was just a waitress, someone who had spent her whole life in the quiet corners of the city, working hard, asking nothing, wanting no trouble and bringing none to others. But now, everything had changed. Trouble hadn't knocked, it had kicked the door down, carrying a briefcase and a hunter's stare. Gracie glanced at the wall clock. Nearly 1 a.m. She knew Vincent wouldn't stop. A man like him with eyes like that would not accept losing a trail twice. And if he found the old woman, what then? Would he take her home? Lock her away? Demand answers for the silence that had haunted him for 23 years? Or were there others, men more dangerous than him, also hunting her, not for love or closure, but for whatever she carried? A secret, a piece of evidence, a reason to kill. Gracie stood up and began to clean the tables, wiping each one as she had done for years. But when her cloth reached the chair where Ellie had always sat, her hand trembled. A strange certainty rose within her. Quiet yet undeniable, the old woman would not return. And Gracie, in some impossible way, though she had only ever served the soup, was now part of the story herself, not as a bystander, but as the only living soul left who knew that the old woman had been here, had once existed, and was now being hunted by her own son. Gracie didn't sleep that night. She sat in the diner's kitchen until dawn, the damp wool scarf Ellie had left behind resting on the table like a cold reminder. Everything inside her was tangled fear, confusion, anger, and something nameless swelling in her chest, a helpless ache at the thought that her kindness might have put someone in danger. When the clock struck 5, she pulled on her worn coat, took the scarf, and stepped out into the gray morning. The rain had eased but not stopped. Ellie couldn't have gone far. She was too frail, and the streets were slick with cold. Gracie moved quickly down the wet sidewalks, eyes searching beneath awnings, bus stops, and the back doors of shuttered shops. At the third intersection, beneath the awning of an old laundromat long out of business, she saw a small figure curled up between 2 trash bins. The familiar gray coat, the wild silver hair, the hands clasped tightly around her knees. "Ellie," Gracie called softly, her voice trembling. The old woman flinched, lifting her head, her eyes widening in disbelief that someone had come for her. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice brittle with cold. "Please, don't get involved." Gracie didn't answer. She knelt down, draped the wool scarf over Ellie's shoulders, and took her icy hands in her own. "I can't leave you out here. Not when they're looking for you." Ellie looked into Gracie's eyes for a long time. There was something in that gaze, resignation, exhaustion, and a pain that had been buried for too many years. Finally, she nodded. They made their way back through the maze of narrow alleys, avoiding the main roads, slipping past rusted fire escapes and dripping stairwells. Gracie didn't take her to the diner. She feared Vincent's men were already watching. Instead, she led her to a small attic apartment above the laundromat where she rented a room. The space was barely 20 square meters, just enough for a narrow bed, a tiny electric stove, and a small table by the window. Ellie sat on the bed, shivering. Gracie brewed a cup of hot tea, placed it in her hands, and took the chair opposite. There was nowhere left to run, no silence left to hide behind. "I think it's time you told me the truth," Gracie said softly but firmly. "About Vincent. About you. About everything." Ellie set the cup down, her fingers entwining in her lap as if trying to hold her memories together before they spilled out too fast. "My real name is Eleanor Russo," she began, her eyes distant. "And yes, Vincent is my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Gracie could hear the wind moaning through the window. Eleanor spoke slowly, as if each word was a blade turning inside her. She had once been the wife of Anthony Russo, one of New York's most notorious crime lords in the 1980s. They called him the King of the Ports, but his empire stretched far beyond the docks. Anthony controlled smuggling routes, laundering networks, and darker trades no one dared name. Eleanor had once loved him. In their youth, Anthony had been charming, polished, capable of making anyone feel adored. But after their marriage, she realized she was nothing more than a crystal vase on display, something to admire, not to hear. Then Vincent was born. Their only child, the one Anthony pinned all his hopes on. Eleanor had simply wanted her son to live as an ordinary boy, but Anthony had other plans. He taught Vincent things no child should learn: how to read secret ledgers at 13, how to command without shouting, how to make people fear without a knife. "I tried to stop him," Eleanor whispered, tears glinting in her eyes. "We fought for years. I even threatened to take Vincent away. But one night, when Vincent was 17, Anthony told her it was time for his son's first step, a test of loyalty, a betrayal that needed to be erased. I couldn't let it happen," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "And I knew that if I stayed, if I only cried and begged, Vincent would do it. He would kill, for the first time." So Eleanor disappeared. She staged her own death, erased herself from her son's world, left behind everything: her home, her name, her life, to save the boy who didn't know he was being shaped into his father's shadow. Gracie sat motionless. In front of her was no longer a mysterious old woman or a quiet customer. She was a mother who had sacrificed everything and perhaps still come too late to save her son. Gracie said nothing for several minutes after Eleanor finished her story. The small room filled only with the soft tick of the wall clock and the slow, rhythmic hum of the washing machines below, like a heartbeat echoing through the floorboards. Pale morning light slipped through the thin curtains, falling across the gaunt face of the woman once known as Eleanor Russo, a woman the world had believed dead for more than 20 years. Gracie looked into her eyes and saw an entire lifetime of exhaustion, guilt, and waiting. "Vincent believes you're dead," Gracie said quietly. "But he still came to the diner, still searched, still called you his mother." Eleanor nodded faintly, as if she too didn't know what had reignited his suspicions. Maybe someone had seen her. Maybe an old photo had resurfaced. Or maybe it was blood, those invisible threads that still tremble when two hearts once bound by it drift too close. "I planned it carefully," Eleanor said, her gaze lost beyond the rain-streaked window. "I left belongings behind: documents, a few strands of hair on my brush, enough for the police to stage an accident. A drowning. They never found a body, but Anthony had enough power to close the case quickly. Vincent had just turned 17. Gracie thought of Vincent, the man who had entered her diner like a specter, leaving behind a photograph and 6 words: "That's my mother." He had lived half his life believing she was gone, perhaps hating her for abandoning him, perhaps aching for the only place of warmth he had ever known in a world built on blood and control. "Do you realize how much danger you're in, Ellie?" Gracie asked softly. Eleanor turned to her, and for the first time there was fear in her eyes. "I do," she said. "If Vincent finds me, he won't just ask why. He'll think I betrayed him, that I left him by choice. And the men around him, they won't let me live. Not because I'm his mother, but because I'm a leak, a loose thread that could unravel everything." A chill ran down Gracie's spine. "You mean—" Eleanor hesitated, then exhaled slowly, as if breaking a seal that had long held back the truth. She reached for her old handbag, pulled out a thick envelope wrapped in waterproof plastic, sealed tight. "Everything's in here," she whispered. "Bank statements, Swiss accounts, the names of politicians, judges, and officers who took money from Anthony, handwritten letters, a copy of a will he destroyed. I kept it all. At first to protect myself, but later, I kept it to remind myself that I was right to leave." Gracie stared at the envelope, feeling its weight press through the air. It wasn't just paper. It was evidence that could erase an empire. The kind of truth a man like Vincent Russo would cross a city in the middle of a storm, to reclaim a truth buried with the mother he believed had been dead for 23 years. "If anyone finds out you're alive," Gracie murmured, "and that you still have this—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Eleanor tightened her grip on the envelope, then hid it back in her bag. Her eyes, suddenly fierce, met Gracie's. "They'll kill me." Without hesitation, silence fell again, heavy and alive. Gracie rose, poured more tea for Eleanor, then glanced toward the window. A black car rolled slowly down the street outside. It didn't stop, but it didn't hurry away either. Gracie felt her blood turn cold. "They'll go back to the diner," she said. "They'll look for you. For me. If they see you alive, this won't be just between you and Vincent anymore." Eleanor said nothing. She simply looked out at the wet, glistening street, her reflection faint in the window pane. She knew Gracie was right, and Gracie knew that from the moment Vincent Russo had stepped into her diner holding that photograph, neither of them had any way back. A mother thought to be dead, a son who could never forgive, and a waitress caught between their worlds, all because of a bowl of soup and one small act of kindness that had become the thin, fragile thread holding a life together. Gracie drew the curtains shut, checked the locks twice, then turned off all but the small bedside lamp. The faint amber glow lit Eleanor's pale face as she leaned against the pillow, her frail hand still gripping the worn handbag in her lap. Neither woman spoke for a long while. Outside, the early morning traffic thinned, the city quieting after the night's storm. Yet the air inside the little apartment was still thick like fog, pressing down on every thought. Gracie stood by the table, her eyes fixed on the wooden door, as if sheer vigilance could make it stronger. Questions kept looping in her mind. How had Vincent found the diner? How could he be so sure Eleanor wasn't dead? Had someone seen her? Or was it that some fracture in the past had begun to leak again? Gracie had never imagined she'd one day be forced to think about running, much less that a simple act of kindness, one bowl of soup each night, would make her a target of a family that once ruled half the city's shadows. But now every path had narrowed. She couldn't go back to the diner, at least not for a few days. If Vincent hadn't found his mother yet, he would return, ask more questions, perhaps threaten, or worse, bring people she would never be able to stop. This tiny room above the laundromat was the only place left where they could breathe in silence. She turned to Eleanor and spoke quietly, almost to herself. "We need to leave. Not now, but soon. Before someone figures it out." Eleanor nodded faintly, though her eyes drifted far beyond the room. "I'm used to running," she whispered so softly that Gracie had to lean closer to hear. "But I never thought someone would run with me." "I don't want you in danger because of me." Gracie shook her head. "You're not alone anymore. I can't look away, not after everything you've told me." She wasn't entirely sure why she felt so certain. All her life she'd avoided other people's troubles, kept to herself, never asked questions. But something about Eleanor, perhaps her solitude that mirrored Gracie's own, perhaps those tired eyes that had never begged for mercy, made it impossible to turn away. Gracie went to the table, opened a drawer, and took out a sheet of paper and a pen. "I have an old friend outside Pennsylvania," she said. "His name's Luke. Used to be a mechanic, now he restores vintage motorcycles. Lives alone, keeps to himself. We can stay there for a while, until we figure things out." Eleanor looked uneasy. "Are you sure? Can you trust him?" Gracie smiled, a small, genuine smile that barely reached her eyes, but warmed the air between them. "If there's anyone I can trust besides you, it's him. We were friends once, for a short while, but long enough for me to know he doesn't ask questions." She wrote down an address, folded the note, and slipped it into her coat pocket. The road to Luke's place wouldn't be easy. They'd have to take several buses, avoid major stations, carry almost nothing. Gracie would have to leave everything behind: the diner, her job, the tiny apartment she'd called home for years, and the quiet routine of clinking spoons and morning coffee. But since the moment Eleanor had revealed the envelope, she'd known there was no place left untouched by danger. "We go tonight," she said. "I have some cash in the safe, enough to get us far enough." Eleanor nodded. She didn't argue, just brushed her fingers over the handbag as if to reassure herself that the secret inside was still intact. Gracie turned to the window. The street below was washed clean by rain, the laundromat still shuttered, the world oblivious to the fugitives hidden above. But she knew the peace wouldn't last. Vincent would return, and if he didn't find them, others would, the men in black suits, silent and sharp as blades tucked beneath their jackets. Gracie drew a slow breath. This wasn't just about running anymore. It was about choosing what to keep buried and what to bring into the light. And, perhaps most painfully, about whether a woman like Eleanor Russo could ever escape her own shadow, or whether she had already pulled another soul down with her into the abyss of the past. Vincent Russo stood by the large window of the penthouse on the highest floor of a building bordering Central Park, his gaze fixed on the city waking below as traffic thickened. The white shirt beneath his black vest lay smooth and unwrinkled, yet the hands clasped behind his back were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and after 2 decades of believing his mother dead, he had the impossible sight of her turning up in a shabby Brooklyn diner, hair silvered and disheveled, eyes avoiding his own. And whatever rose in Vincent at that moment was not mere anger but a slow, subterranean seismic ache. Bruised pride, an unspoken betrayal, and a bewilderment he would never let anyone see. Behind him, Dominic, his loyal right hand, entered and set a stack of files on the glass table, speaking in an even voice. The security cameras around the diner blurred by rain, but his men had followed her from the back alley until the trail vanished. No car, no card transactions. Someone had helped her. Vincent did not turn, watching the pale sunlight spill across the low rooftops in the distance, and said slowly, "I know it's the waitress. She knows something." And Dominic nodded as if he had expected that, asking if he should handle it. But Vincent hesitated. The image of the middle-aged woman with brown hair threaded with silver, and the kindly yet wary eyes as he had seen when he pushed the photograph across the counter, replaying in his mind. She was not the sort to lie for long, nor easily cowed by threats, and in that look Vincent saw something he had seen once in his mother before she vanished. A stubborn tenderness that felt almost unbearably like a clue. He shook his head. Not yet, she is the key, but not the time to squeeze. And Dominic did not press, instead spreading out stills printed from footage that showed Eleanor entering the diner on many nights. A pattern they could reconstruct, a radius of a few blocks where she might be hiding, and if someone aided her it would almost certainly be a neighbor. Vincent picked up a photograph and his eye rested on a small detail in the lower corner. A familiar gray wool scarf draped over Eleanor's arm, a thing not everyone would notice, but Vincent did, because it was the last gift he had given her on the Christmas when he was 16, and she had clutched it that night, saying she had never received anything so warm. And then, only a year later, she had disappeared without a word, declared dead, and he had once gone himself to receive the death certificate, stood before her portrait at the small memorial, feeling something squeeze his chest and never let go. "I want every camera in that area reviewed for the past 3 days," he said, voice low and harder. "Every strange vehicle, every figure moving at night, because if someone is sheltering her, then they are holding a live bomb." And Dominic left to call the surveillance teams. Vincent continued to stare at the photograph, remembering how once he had believed his mother a victim, and then the seed of doubt had taken root, and now seeing her eyes bent away, walking like a ghost through rain, he could not tell whether his anger was at her for leaving, or at himself for craving an explanation all these years. He moved to the glass cabinet, opened a small wooden box, and took out a vintage silver hair clip, the only remnant of Eleanor from those last days, an heirloom he had kept like a relic, and now it felt like a missing puzzle piece pleading for an answer. "I do not know why she left," he said without looking at anyone, "but I will find out, even if I have to turn this whole city inside out." And Dominic returned his look with something that mixed respect and caution, for he knew that once Vincent had set his mind to something, nothing stood in the way, and this time what he sought was not an enemy or a traitor but a mother pronounced dead, and if she lived there must be a reason for her disappearance, either an unforgivable sin or a secret so vast it could kill anyone who touched it. The small room above the laundromat was as quiet as any morning after rain, but inside, Gracie could feel an invisible weight pressing against the air. Eleanor sat propped against the headboard, a blanket pulled to her knees, clutching her handbag as though it held the last flicker of her heartbeat. Gracie set a cup of tea on the table and took the seat across from her, her gaze steady yet edged with worry. "Vincent has started the search," she said softly. "I can feel him turning over every stone in the city just to find you." Eleanor didn't look surprised. She closed her eyes and leaned back, the breath leaving her chest with a sound that carried the ache of years. "I know," she murmured. "Vincent is Anthony's son. He was raised in the dark, taught to live there, and now, he's become part of it." Gracie was quiet for a moment before asking gently, "Anthony Russo? What kind of man was he, really?" Eleanor opened her eyes but didn't meet Gracie's. Instead, she stared at the cracked gray wall behind her, its flaking paint like her own memory, dry, uneven, but still standing. "Anthony was the most charming man I had ever met," she began, her voice low, trembling like an old record playing through static. "I met him when I was 19, studying art history. He came to the museum with a few men, said little, just stood before one painting for over an hour. When I asked what he saw in it, he said, 'The beauty isn't in the technique, it's in what the artist dared to hide.' I should have walked away then." She paused, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "We married within 8 months. It was a dream until the phone calls began at midnight, until strange men came and went, until the money never ran out, yet never had a name attached to it. I once asked, and he smiled, brushed his hand over my cheek, and said, 'My queen, You were never meant to step into the castle's basement. But I did. A chill crept up Gracie's spine. She didn't interrupt. She knew Eleanor needed to let the ghost speak at last. That basement wasn't a room, Eleanor said, her tone steadying. It was who he truly was. Cold, controlling, without mercy. Anthony never needed to shout. A single glance, a nod, and someone would vanish. Once, I saw him wipe his hands with a white towel after a meeting with partners. I washed that towel later. There was blood in every thread. Her voice rasped with memory. When I became pregnant with Vincent, I hoped it would change him. And for a time, it did. He smiled more, told me stories from his childhood. But it was only a mask. By the time Vincent turned 5, Anthony was teaching him to balance in silence, to listen without speaking, to know who was loyal and who was a threat. He didn't want a son. He wanted an heir. Eleanor lifted her eyes to meet Gracie's, red-rimmed but lucid. I was weak. I let it go on too long, until Vincent was 17, and Anthony decided it was time for his first test. A man in the organization had leaked information. Anthony wanted Vincent to prove his loyalty by handling it himself. Gracie's breath caught. She couldn't imagine the horror of a mother watching her child be molded into a killer. I begged, Eleanor said, voice trembling. I got on my knees, but Anthony didn't listen. That's when I knew if I didn't disappear, I would lose Vincent forever. Not his body, his soul. She drew a deep breath, eyes closing. So, I staged the accident, left enough evidence for Anthony to believe I was gone. I knew it would break Vincent's heart, but at least I spared him from taking a life for his father's approval. Gracie sat still, her heart heavy with a mix of sorrow, fury, and a deep, wordless respect. Eleanor was far from perfect, but she had done what few could: walk away from the devil and save her son at the cost of her own existence. Yet now, the devil was dead, and his ghost lived on inside Vincent. And when he learned the truth, would he see the light in what his mother had sacrificed, or only the betrayal of a woman he still believed had left him in silence? Gracie didn't take her eyes off Eleanor for the rest of that afternoon, even though the old woman hadn't spoken another word since finishing her story about Anthony. Her face had gone still, weathered like stone that had endured too much wind and rain, serene in a way that unsettled Gracie. For it wasn't peace she saw there. It was surrender, resignation, and Gracie could not let that be the end of it. As dusk crept through the small attic window, she slipped on her coat, scribbled a few simple instructions for Eleanor in case of emergency, and carefully stepped out. Before closing the door, she turned back. The frail figure sat by the window, her head tilted, eyes lost somewhere deep in another lifetime. "I'll be back soon," Gracie whispered. "I'm going to find someone I can trust." Eleanor didn't ask who or where, only nodded faintly as though she already knew Gracie was searching not for safety, but for something to keep their faith alive a little longer. Gracie descended the creaking stairs, passed through the shuttered laundromat, and crossed the street where puddles still glimmered under the streetlights long after the rain had stopped. She caught the last bus leaving Brooklyn, heading toward the outskirts of Pennsylvania to the only man she had ever trusted without needing to ask why. Luke lived alone in an old wooden house beside a small repair shop on a hill, where the road was carpeted with fallen leaves, and the wind through the pines whispered like the language of another world. By the time she stepped off the bus, night had fallen completely. The air was sharp with the scent of wet soil and pine resin. Gracie walked the gravel path, heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The only light came from a single yellow bulb above the workshop door, and in that glow stood a tall, broad-shouldered man, motionless beside a half-finished motorcycle. Gracie stopped at the wooden gate. "Luke," she called, her voice trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of everything she was about to say. The man turned, eyes keen beneath salt and pepper hair. He stared for a long moment, as if to make sure she wasn't a dream from years ago, then strode forward, opening the gate. His gaze softened like that of someone recognizing a lost friend. "Gracie," he said quietly, and without another question he took the bag from her shoulder. "Come in, you're safe here." The cabin smelled exactly as she remembered: pinewood and half-roasted coffee, the kind of warmth that comes from silence rather than fire. They sat facing each other at the long wooden table by the window, and Gracie began to speak. She held nothing back. Not the danger, not the fear, not the name Vincent Russo or the waterproof envelope filled with secrets that could burn down an empire. Luke didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his fingertips resting on the edge of his cup as though steadying something fragile: her voice, her resolve, or maybe both. When she finished, he nodded once, slow and firm. "You and the old lady can stay here," he said, his tone quiet but solid as oak. "There's a room upstairs. No one knows this place, and if anyone comes looking, they'll have to go through me first." Gracie let out a soft laugh, the first in days. She didn't need him to prove his strength or make promises. That one sentence was enough. She'd been right to come here. Luke was the rare, still point in a world splintering beneath their feet. "I'll go back for her in the morning," she said. "We can't wait much longer. Vincent must have returned to the diner by now, and my apartment, it's probably compromised too." Luke nodded, then met her gaze with quiet respect. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Gracie looked back at him, eyes shining with a gratitude words couldn't touch. And in that moment she knew no matter what would fall apart next, no matter what ghosts would rise from the past, there was still a place where she and Eleanor could pause, breathe, and think about the road ahead, no matter how far it would lead them. Eleanor couldn't sleep that night, no matter how many times Gracie had urged her to rest, to gather her strength for the journey ahead. She sat motionless in the old wooden chair beneath the attic lamp, its pale yellow light spilling over her hollow face, hands gripping the strap of her bag as if letting go would make the world collapse. Outside, Brooklyn's night was as it always had been, damp, noisy, uneasy, but inside her, the echoes of the past were louder than any siren or horn. Each time she closed her eyes, the scenes returned in fragments, like an unfinished reel of film that refused to stop spinning. It was a summer night more than 20 years ago, the last time she ever stepped inside the Russo mansion. Vincent had just turned 17. Anthony was deep in the spiral of his own paranoia, convinced a federal investigation was closing in and suspecting everyone, his associates, his friends, even his wife. Eleanor remembered that night vividly. Anthony had told her to bring Vincent to an abandoned warehouse by the docks. "Just to observe," he'd said. "He needs to understand reality, not just listen to his parents argue." Even then, the air had turned cold, unnatural for summer. Eleanor had tried to protest, inventing excuses to keep Vincent home, but the look in Anthony's eyes had made her shiver. He wasn't the polished man she had once loved. He was a predator testing how far his prey would go to protect its young. They arrived at the warehouse around 9. No moon, just the salty wind rolling off the harbor. Inside, a man sat tied to a chair, his face swollen and bruised. Anthony leaned casually against a crate, cigar smoke curling through the shadows, and smiled at his son. "Tonight's your first lesson," he said. "This man betrayed us. What would you do?" Vincent froze, still so young, eyes wide with confusion. He looked to Eleanor for an answer, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. When Anthony placed a small pistol wrapped in black cloth into his son's hands, Eleanor felt her heart fall into an abyss. That was the moment she knew. If she didn't act, her son would step across a line he could never return from. She lunged forward, pulling Vincent behind her, begging Anthony to stop. He only laughed low, cruel, certain. "You don't understand what I'm building," he said. "This is our future." "No," Eleanor screamed. "It's a crime." Then came the gunshot. Not from Vincent's hand, from one of the guards at the door. Chaos erupted, shouting, crashing, footsteps pounding against concrete. Eleanor grabbed Vincent's wrist and dragged him toward the back exit, while Anthony's curses followed them into the dark. She didn't know what had just happened, only that if Vincent stayed, if he saw too much, he would lose more than his innocence. He would lose his soul. And unless she vanished, unless she created an earthquake big enough to make Anthony believe she was gone forever, he would never stop. No one would ever stop him. A few days later, Eleanor staged the accident at Riverside Bridge. A car sunk into the river, a single shoe left on the railing, strands of hair in a brush, a few drops of blood planted for effect. No body was ever found. To the world, Eleanor Russo was dead. What remained was a ruthless widower, and a boy growing more like his father each year. She spent the decades that followed in hiding, changing names, cities, jobs, living like a ghost among the living. But what haunted her most wasn't the danger. It was not knowing what her son had become. Had her disappearance freed him from Anthony's grip, or had it forged him into something colder, harder, unrecognizable? And now, with Vincent searching, with that look in his eyes as he stared at the photograph in the diner, she knew the day of reckoning was near. Gracie returned early the next morning, exhaustion written in the lines of her face after the long journey. When she stepped into the room, Eleanor was still sitting where she had left her, as if she hadn't moved all night. "I found the place," Gracie said quietly. We need to leave. Now. Before anyone discovers this spot. Eleanor nodded, rising to her feet, tightening her grip on the bag. Her eyes met Gracie's for a long, steady moment. If they find me this time, she said softly, I won't run again. Gracie didn't answer. She only took Eleanor's hand, gave it a firm squeeze, and opened the door. Together they stepped into the morning light. The city washed clean after the storm. But for Eleanor, the sky hadn't truly brightened yet, not until she knew whether her son could still be saved, or whether he had become another shadow cast by Anthony Russo himself. Luke's old pickup truck roared down the forest road, tires crunching through potholes buried under fallen leaves, kicking up dust that hung in the cool air like ghosts refusing to fade. Eleanor sat in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the blur of trees outside, her face still as stone, though her mind churned like a storm beneath the surface. Gracie sat beside her, glancing over now and then to make sure the old woman was still holding on, though she knew full well that no one truly held on after walking out of decades of hiding, only to face everything they had once fled. Luke said little, driving with the calm determination of a man who had already accepted the road before him. His wooden house appeared after a long curve nestled against the hillside, its moss-covered roof and weather-worn porch glowing faintly in the dusk light. When the truck stopped, Eleanor lingered a moment, staring at the cabin, as if weighing whether to step forward or run back into the woods. Gracie placed a steady hand on her shoulder. We just need quiet for a while, she whispered. Then we'll figure out the rest. In the days that followed, the three lived together in a silence that felt strange yet tender. Luke spent his mornings in the workshop, repairing engines with the slow patience of a man who trusted time. Gracie cooked, cleaned, and tried to keep her hands busy enough to stop her mind from circling back to the danger they'd left behind. Eleanor spent hours by the window, writing filling page after page with fragments of memory she knew one day she'd have to hand to someone brave enough to face the truth. But peace is never permanent, and Eleanor had always known that. One late afternoon, when the light was fading between the pines, Gracie found her sitting motionless by the fireplace, eyes fixed on the flame as if it held her entire life within its flicker. "I've finished the letter to Vincent," Eleanor said softly. "I told him everything why I left, about Anthony, about the things I did to save him from the life his father wanted. But I don't know if he'll believe me." Gracie sat beside her, studying the deep lines carved by time and grief across her face. "He isn't 17 anymore, Ellie. He's a man who's lived too long with the wound of being left behind. Maybe he won't forgive you, but at least he'll know." Eleanor nodded faintly, her gaze never leaving the fire. "I used to think love was enough, that if I disappeared, he'd find another path. But now I see. Love without truth can be its own kind of betrayal." Gracie fell silent. She knew Eleanor wasn't just speaking of herself and Vincent, but of countless mothers and fathers who had chosen silence in the name of protection, never realizing that silence could sever the last thread, connecting them to the ones they loved. "So you'll send the letter?" Gracie asked quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "Not yet. I want to see him. To look him in the eyes when I tell him everything, even if it's just for a minute. I want him to know I was watching all along, that I didn't die. I just gave up part of my life so he could live another." Outside, the wind had shifted. A flock of crows swept across the treetops, their cries slicing through the twilight air like warnings from another world. Gracie rose, poured Eleanor a cup of hot tea, then sat back down beside her like a daughter keeping vigil beside her mother. Neither spoke again, because at the meeting point of love and betrayal, there are no right words, only the courage to face the consequences of both, and the quiet understanding that even an imperfect love is still the one thing strong enough to hold people together when everything else has already begun to fall apart. Eleanor sat at the wooden table in Luke's small kitchen, the soft amber light casting hazy strokes across her face, as though time itself had slowed to watch. Before her lay the old waterproof envelope, its nylon cover dulled by years of hiding, the paper edges curled from being folded too long. Gracie sat across from her, neither speaking for a while. Only the ticking clock and the gentle crackle of firewood from the hearth filled the silence, a reminder that even quiet moments demanded their own price. Eleanor drew the envelope closer. She had carried it for nearly 20 years, through midnight buses with no destination, nameless rented rooms, and countless rainstorms where her only companion was the sound of her own breathing in the dark. She had thought about destroying it, burning it, tossing it into a river, but every time she came close, she would see Vincent's face at 12 years old, scribbling on the kitchen table with a piece of charcoal, telling her that one day he'd build a house where everyone could hide when they were afraid. Eleanor hadn't kept the envelope out of spite, or to seek revenge. She kept it as a reminder that silence, when stretched too long, becomes complicity. And she had been silent long enough. Her hands trembled slightly as she peeled back the tape sealing the edge. Gracie stayed still, her eyes fixed on every careful motion, as though she too were stepping into a world that had existed only through stories. Inside were bundles of old documents, many yellowed but still legible. There were records of transfers to foreign accounts, names that had once appeared on the front pages of newspapers, men and women who had sat in parliament seats, cut ribbons at schools, and stood beside police chiefs at press conferences condemning crime. There were handwritten letters in Anthony's firm script orders that needed no code, written by a man too certain of his own untouchable power. Among the pages was a single photograph, black and white, of a woman beside a Cadillac. Behind her stood a young boy, Vincent, his small, uncertain face framed by his father's arm resting heavily on his shoulder. Gracie lifted a sheet of paper, her eyes pausing on the bold heading at the top. Supplementary will valid only if the original is lost or destroyed. She turned to Eleanor, her voice low. This could topple an entire dynasty. Eleanor nodded, still staring at the photo. I didn't keep it to blackmail anyone, she said softly. I kept it because if I died without leaving something behind, every sin would be buried with me. And Vincent, he'd think my silence meant fear. But the truth is, I once believed silence was protection. Now I know it only prolongs the pain. Gracie set the papers down, her expression thoughtful, as though weighing the cost of every word she had just read. What do we do with them? Eleanor didn't answer right away. She rose, walking to the window overlooking the backyard blanketed with pine needles. I'll see Vincent, she said finally. I'll place these in front of him, not to threaten, but to show him I didn't run because I was afraid. I ran because I couldn't let the man he's become be the man Anthony made him to be. Gracie joined her at the window, quiet for a long time before asking softly, And if he doesn't want to listen? Eleanor smiled faintly, a sad, steady smile. Then I'll still speak, because when a mother hides the truth, it isn't to protect her child, it's because she fears he'll stop loving her, and I've lived in that fear long enough. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the forest, and the pine boughs rustled like 1,000 unseen hands, some waving farewell, others warning. Gracie looked at Eleanor and saw something new in her eyes, not the weary resignation of a woman on the run, but the resolve of one ready to end the silence. The price of that silence had never been just the lost years. It was a legacy of power and deceit passed on to those who never asked for it. And now, Eleanor was done paying. When her voice finally rose, there would be no pretending not to hear. Night fell thick and soundless over Luke's cabin. The sky was a solid sheet of darkness, no stars, no moon, only the suffocating weight of black pressing down on the forest. Inside, Eleanor had just returned the waterproof envelope to the hidden drawer in the upstairs bedroom. Downstairs, Gracie and Luke were finishing a late supper, the faint scent of roasted meat mingling with the hum of an old jazz tune drifting from the radio. For a moment, it felt like peace had finally chosen their side, a fragile, borrowed kind of peace that made them forget the world outside. But peace, as always, was only an illusion. The first black car appeared just before midnight, its headlights off, tires grinding softly against the gravel road that led to the cabin. Then came a second, then a third. Dark figures emerged, all dressed in black, moving with the precision of men who had memorized the rhythm of fear. Dominic led them, headset pressed to one ear, his expression glacial and deliberate. He wasn't there to search, he was there to end. With a silent gesture, the men spread out, circling the property, guns drawn, the forest swallowing their shadows whole. Inside, Luke had just set a plate on the table when the kitchen light flickered. He froze. Years of instinct born from battlefields and nights spent hunted rose in him like a tide. He turned off the radio and motioned for Gracie to stay quiet. Upstairs, Eleanor sensed the shift before she heard it, the kind of stillness that has weight. She stepped out of her room and gripped the stair rail just as a soft pop echoed outside, small but sharp enough to snap every nerve taut. Luke moved quickly. He pulled open a drawer beneath the counter, revealing an old revolver, still clean and oiled. Downstairs, he whispered, eyes never leaving the front door. Now, don't look back. There's a tunnel behind the old fireplace. Follow it straight until you hit the trail. Gracie nodded, grabbing Eleanor's hand. But the old woman hesitated for one aching second. If they found us, It means Vincent. No, Gracie cut in, her tone fierce and steady. That's Dominic. If Vincent wanted to find you, he wouldn't send killers. Luke stood his ground before the door, his back straight, as if wearing a uniform again. The glass pane rattled with the force of a kick, then shattered as the first gunshot split the night. Gracie and Eleanor barely reached the cellar before a bullet tore through the window, embedding itself in the wooden beam above the stove. The air erupted with chaos, glass breaking, boots thundering against the porch, shouts slicing through the cold. In the dark below, Gracie groped for the narrow passage Luke had once described, a gap behind the hearth that led to an old escape route. Eleanor followed, her movement slow but unyielding. She could feel her pulse drumming in her temples, but there was no room for fear. She could not die tonight, not when the truth still lived inside her, not when Vincent still believed she had abandoned him. Above them, the firefight raged. Luke fired with the precision of someone who had long accepted the cost of courage. Each shot was deliberate. Restrained, he wasn't fighting to win, only to buy them time. Dominic realized it quickly. He gestured for a man to flank the house, certain there was another exit, but by then, Eleanor and Gracie had slipped through the hidden tunnel and into the forest beyond. The trees swallowed them whole. The darkness became their shelter. The wind whipped through the pines like a voice both mourning and warning. Branches clawed at Eleanor's sleeves. Roots snagged her shoes, but she didn't stop, not once. Every step felt like a heartbeat calling out across the distance, echoing toward the sun she had lost to shadows. "I'm still here," her heart cried, even as her breath burned in the cold. "I'm still running toward you, Vincent, even if the world tears me away before I can speak your name." The morning wind swept through the overgrown garden beside the Rousseau estate, carrying with it the damp scent of years left to rot. What had once been the heart of an empire now stood cloaked in moss and silence, its grand windows clouded with grime, the roof sagging as though a single breath could bring it down. Yet despite time's decay, the air inside still felt dense, heavy with memory, guilt, and sins that refused to fade. Eleanor stood before the towering black iron gates, her gaze fixed on the house, not with fear, not with nostalgia, but with something quieter, acceptance. Gracie stood beside her, a faint scrape on her shoulder still raw from their flight through the forest the night before, but her eyes were clear. They had come full circle. No one needed to tell them this was where it had to end. The gate swung open without a sound, as if someone had been expecting them. The long hallway leading to the main room was lined with the same faded velvet carpet, the same portraits of Rousseau ancestors staring down from the walls. Eleanor's eyes lingered on one painting, Anthony, in his three-piece suit, his proud gaze fixed outward, as though he were still watching over everything from beyond the grave. She kept walking, her steps steady. Gracie followed, clutching the bag that held the envelope, its weight seeming heavier than ever. When they reached the last room, Vincent was there. He stood by the window, back turned, the weak morning light stretching his shadow across the marble floor. Eleanor didn't speak. She only watched him. For a long moment, he didn't move either. When he finally did, his voice came low and gravelly, as though the words had been waiting too many years to be spoken. "You really didn't die." Gracie froze. Vincent turned, and his eyes, once filled with fury, now carried something more complex. Exhaustion, sorrow, a fracture too deep for rage to mend. Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "No." He took a step closer, then stopped. "Why? You let me live with a ghost. You let me believe you were murdered, that he was the victim. You made me become—" Eleanor interrupted him, calm but firm. "No, Vincent. He chose that path. Your father made that choice long before you could. I only tried to pull you back, if only for a single step. If I hadn't vanished that night, you'd have become him." She paused, eyes unwavering. "Do you remember the docks? The man tied to the chair? The gun in your hand?" Vincent's jaw clenched, his fingers curling into fists. "I was there," Eleanor said softly. "I saw you. I pulled you away. You asked why I was afraid, and I couldn't answer." She took another step toward him, her voice trembling only slightly. "Now I can. It wasn't the blood that terrified me. It was losing you to a world that doesn't let its sons come back." Arcanery. Vincent stared at her, and for the first time in decades, he saw not the ghost of his past but the mother who had once held him close on freezing New Jersey nights, humming lullabies against the echo of gunfire in the distance. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Why now? After all these years, Eleanor opened her bag, pulled out the envelope, and placed it gently on the table between them. Because you need the truth before it's too late, not to condemn him, but to choose something different. Everything your father did, everything buried under your name is in here, and the people continuing it in your shadow. Vincent didn't reach for it. He only exhaled a long, weary breath that seemed to drain years from him. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the trees. Clouds gathered above the estate like witnesses to a reckoning long overdue. Some knots, Eleanor thought, cannot be untied by running away. You have to return to the place where they were first pulled tight and pull until they break. The old parlor of the Rousseau estate was wrapped in a silence so taut it seemed alive. Trembling on the edge of shattering, Eleanor stood across from her son, her hands at her sides, her gaze fixed on the man before her, the man who was no longer the boy she used to pedal to school on her bicycle, no longer the teenager who once wept at the sight of blood splattered across his sleeve after Anthony's first lesson. Now, Vincent sat in his father's worn leather chair, his posture rigid, his hands resting on his knees as though he were holding back something that lived between rage and grief. Eleanor could see it, the war inside him, between the fury of a son abandoned and the longing of a child still desperate to be seen, to be loved, to be forgiven. Vincent didn't open the envelope right away. He turned it over in his hands, weighing it, as though trying to feel how many years of truth and lies it contained. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clouded, his voice low and raw. Why? Why didn't you come for me? Why did you let me grow up with whispers, with people looking at me like I was the tragedy they couldn't name? You let me believe you died in pain. You left me an orphan with a father, but no one who actually stayed. Eleanor took a slow step forward, her shoes silent against the faded velvet carpet. She stopped a few paces away, her voice steady but soft. Because if I had come back sooner, you wouldn't have listened. You would have seen me as the traitor who ran from your father, from the Rousseau name. Your heart still belonged to him, then to the story he built around his power. I had to wait until you were old enough to question him. Vincent flinched as if struck. He turned his head away, closing his eyes. The words landed harder than any bullet he'd ever heard. He rose abruptly and walked toward the window, his back to her. You can't imagine. He was all I had after you died. Cold or not, ruthless or not, he taught me how to survive, how to look at a man and make him afraid to lie, how to make people loyal or gone. Without him, Eleanor's voice cut through his sentence, gentle but firm. Without him, you would have been free. You wouldn't have had to learn to live as though everyone around you were an enemy. I don't blame you for following him, Vincent. I only grieve the man you might have been if you'd had another choice. Arminus, he turned sharply, anger flashing behind his exhaustion. What do you know about my choices? You weren't there. You didn't see what it took just to stay alive, to hold on to what little control I had. You left me with the darkness and expected me to step into the light. Eleanor didn't move. No, I never expected you to become light. I only prayed you'd have the courage to see that you're standing in the dark and know you still have the right to step out of it. Jesters. Vincent let out a dry, broken laugh. No, not after what I've done. After what I've allowed. There's no right left for me. Eleanor stepped closer. Her voice trembled but didn't falter. Who told you that? Dominic? Or the ones who need you to stay your father's son so they can use your name to control everything he built? Do you think cruelty is the only legacy of the Rousseaus? No, Vincent. You have me. And I never forgot you. Vincent recoiled half a step, as though her words had cornered him. His eyes locked on hers, eyes full of pain, memories, and a fragile tenderness he had never learned how to show. Eleanor reached out her hand, not too close, not pleading, but steady. It was the hand of a mother offering presence, not absolution. If you want to, I'm still here, it said. Not to be forgiven, but because I'm still your mother. Vincent stared at that hand for a long time, then slowly shook his head, not in rejection, but in helplessness, as if he didn't know how to touch it without falling apart. He turned away, voice gravelly. You should go, before this becomes something we can't undo. Eleanor watched him, her eyes glistening though no tears fell. She nodded once. She understood. This wasn't forgiveness. It was the first fracture in a wall that had stood too long, and for her, that was enough. The heavy wooden door of the Rousseau estate closed behind Eleanor with a muted thud. A quiet period at the end of a reunion that should have happened years ago. She walked slowly down the stone corridor, each step pressing deeper into the weight of memory and the words left unsaid. Behind the thick walls of that house, Vincent remained where she had left him, his shadow stretched long in the fading light of late afternoon. He didn't call her back, he didn't stop her, yet his heart had never been so loud in its silence. On the desk, the envelope still lay untouched. Vincent sat down, picked it up again, this time without hesitation. The papers inside unfolded in his hands, lists of familiar names, numbers, connections he'd once thought were myths whispered in smoke-filled rooms. But buried among them was a smaller sheet, folded in quarters, the handwriting trembling yet unmistakably hers. It was a letter from Eleanor, not an apology, but a confession. He read it line by line, slowly at first, then faster, his breath growing shallow. When his eyes reached the last sentence, his hand tightened until his knuckles went white. The words clawed through him, dragging air from his lungs. And then, in a voice roughened by disbelief, he whispered into the empty room, "Mother killed father." The sound barely broke the air, yet it hit like a bell shattering in the stillness. Vincent staggered backward, as though struck. His thoughts spiraled, clashing memories, rewriting themselves in real time. Eleanor hadn't pulled the trigger. She hadn't taken Anthony's life with her own hands, but she had set the end in motion. She had passed the first files, those quiet, damning proofs, to a former FBI agent, knowing full well what would follow. The investigation had cornered Anthony, and the night he died wasn't an ambush, not a vendetta, but the moment he discovered her betrayal. She had admitted it in her letter. She knew he'd gone too far, that he had crossed every line, and that if she didn't act, Vincent would have no way out. So she had sent the signal, letting the empire Anthony built consume itself. Not from hatred, but from a desperate, unbearable kind of love, a love willing to destroy everything to save what little could still be saved. But for Vincent, that love landed like a bullet. His entire life had been built upon the image of a father cruel, yes, but unshakably loyal, powerful, indestructible, and of a mother who had died as a victim, pure and silent. Now the two figures he had worshipped and mourned collapsed into something too human, too flawed to revere. He moved toward the liquor cabinet, poured a glass of whiskey, and stared at it without drinking. The amber liquid trembled as his hand shook, the reflection warping his face into something unrecognizable. He didn't know what filled him, more rage, betrayal, or relief, perhaps all three. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. From this moment on, there was no path back. The truth had rewritten him, and nothing that bore the name Russo would ever look the same again. Outside, in the garden that time had half reclaimed, Eleanor sat alone on the stone bench where she had once planted white roses. She knew he had read the letter. She knew the silence now sitting over that house was not ignorance, but comprehension. She didn't cry. She had spent her tears in the years of running, of losing everything that once made her soft. Now all she could do was wait, not for forgiveness, but for her son's choice. Eleanor understood that after the truth, Vincent would have to let part of himself die to be reborn, or choose to remain a shadow of the father he had just lost for the second time. Whichever path he chose, she would not hide again. For the first time in her life, she had stepped into the light, and even if that light would burn everything she had left, she would face it, eyes open. Evening settled over the Russo estate as the wind began to rise, carrying with it the thick, metallic heat of something burning far beyond the trees. From the distance, a column of black smoke tore upward through the gray sky like a wound that refused to close. No one knew where the fire had started. The townspeople whispered that it might have been those strangers seen near the property the night before, dark figures that came and vanished like breath on cold glass. Inside, Vincent sat unmoving before the fireplace, the letter from his mother open, beside a forgotten glass of whiskey, gone warm and untouched, his eyes fixed on the flames, searching for answers to questions no one had ever taught him to ask. Everything he had once believed, everything he had been raised to protect, was unraveling undone by a few sheets of paper and a single sentence that said the woman he loved most had turned the wheel that led his father to death. But what shook him most wasn't the betrayal, it was the strange, unbearable lightness pressing against his chest. He had expected rage. He had expected to destroy the room, to shatter the glass, to curse her name. But instead, there was only quiet and exhausted kind of release. Because deep down, perhaps he had always wished it were true. That Anthony Russo wasn't immortal, that someone, somewhere, had been brave enough to stop him, and that the one who did it was his mother. Outside, Eleanor sat on the old stone bench in the overgrown garden, the wind tangling her gray hair as smoke from the forest drifted closer. She didn't flinch. Her eyes followed the horizon where the fire thickened, a warning, not a coincidence. She knew this wasn't an accident. Dominic had likely returned, or someone else had come to erase what remained. But what worried her more than the fire in the woods was the fire she knew would soon ignite in her son's heart, the kind that consumes everything once it begins. Footsteps crunched behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Vincent stopped a few paces away, waiting for her to speak first. But this time, Eleanor said nothing. She simply looked up, her gaze meeting his. For a long, fragile moment, there was only stillness, the kind that exists when two souls finally find each other again, after years of wandering through opposite shadows. "I've read it," Vincent said at last, his voice low but steady. "All of it." Eleanor nodded. "I know. I too then." A gust swept through the garden, carrying the scent of smoke and scorched earth. The roses shivered, leaves whispering like pages turning in a book neither of them could close. Vincent moved closer, lowering himself onto the bench beside her, eyes fixed on the burning sky. "They're cleaning up the trail," he murmured. "Dominic's doing. He wants the past erased. Is Gracie safe?" "She is," Eleanor replied quietly. "She's gone back to town. She won't return until you decide what happens next." "Is." Vincent was silent for a long while before turning to her, his eyes stripped of anger, filled instead with something rawer acceptance, edged with sorrow. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "When you did it? When you led him to his end?" Eleanor didn't meet his gaze. She looked down at her hands, old, trembling, threaded with years, and whispered, "Yes, but I was more afraid of what you would become if I didn't. Everyone." Vincent leaned back against the low stone wall, exhaling a breath that felt like the first one he'd taken in decades. "I've lived too long in his shadow," he said. "Long enough to forget what I wanted for myself." Eleanor reached out, resting her hand lightly on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him since returning. "It's not too late to remember," she said. "If you want to." In the distance, sirens wailed faintly through the wind. The fire was spreading, but so was the light. Vincent rose slowly, turning to face the mansion, the house that had raised him, caged him, and now waited to be consumed. "I have to end this," he said softly. "Not just for you, for me." Eleanor watched him, her lips curving into the smallest, gentlest smile, not the smile of victory, but of peace, the kind born when a seed finally breaks through the ash, proving that even after ruin, something still dares to grow. Night fell again over the Russo estate, the sky sinking into a suffocating shade of black, while far beyond the trees, columns of smoke still rose, faint but relentless, from the forest that had burned all afternoon. In the hearts of Eleanor and Vincent, however, everything had never been clearer. They didn't need to speak to know what was coming. Time was running out. Dominic would not stop, not after learning Eleanor was alive, and certainly not now that Vincent had begun to tilt the balance toward truth instead of power. Eleanor rose from the stone bench in the garden, her eyes tracing a narrow path hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves behind the once white rose bushes. She pushed aside the thorny branches to reveal a small iron door, nearly swallowed by time and neglect. Vincent followed, astonished he had spent his entire childhood in this house and never known it existed. "You once told me this house had its secrets," he murmured. Eleanor gave a faint smile. "It does, but some secrets should only be opened when the time is right. And tonight, Vincent, it is." The old key scraped against the rusted lock. A soft click broke the silence, the sound of inevitability. They descended the narrow stone steps into the earth, guided only by the beam of Vincent's small flashlight. The air was thick and damp, walls slick with age, every footstep echoing like a heartbeat from another lifetime. Eleanor spoke as they walked, her voice a thread weaving through the darkness, how Anthony had built this tunnel as an escape route in case the police ever came. "But I always knew," she said quietly, "that someday I'd be the one who needed it to escape the empire he built out of blood and lies." At the end of the passage, a faint glimmer of moonlight appeared, a small archway leading to the back garden, the one Vincent had played in as a boy. The air that met them was cold and sharp, but clean. The garden looked the same and entirely different, its white roses glistening under the night dew, ghostly in the dark. Eleanor paused for a moment, her hand brushing the petals as if saying goodbye to something that had once been beautiful but never safe. Gracie was waiting there, her figure small and still against the mist, the old pickup truck idling quietly behind her. She had returned after receiving Eleanor's signal, knowing this was the moment everything had to end or begin again. Vincent said nothing, only nodded, his expression filled with a gratitude too deep for words. There was a trust between them now fragile, hard-won, and undeniable. As Eleanor stepped toward the truck, she turned one last time to look at the mansion. Once a sanctuary, then a prison, now just a hollow shell waiting to collapse under the weight of its own secrets. She knew she would never return, not out of fear, but because she had finally reclaimed the only thing that had kept her running for nearly 20 years, the truth. Vincent placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "I don't know what comes after tonight," he said, his voice low, certain. "But if I ever have to choose again, I'll still follow the path you showed me." Eleanor smiled, her eyes glinting with that quiet, unyielding light that only those who have lost everything and lived to understand can carry. They climbed into the truck. Gracie drove forward into the night without a word, the road stretching before them like a promise. Behind them, the garden shimmered faintly in the moonlight, the white roses swaying in the wind, witnesses to a family once buried in darkness, now stepping, at last, into the fragile, blinding light of their own choosing. Dominic sat alone in the attic room of an old hotel in Brooklyn, the same place he once called his transfer station for jobs that left no trace known only to him and Anthony Russo. The table before him was cluttered with a phone, a laptop, and a map scarred with inked lines, escape routes, safe houses, fallback exits. He had always lived like a man one breath away from collapse, thinking 2 moves ahead for every one he made. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Dominic knew there were no moves left. The news that Vincent had left the Russo estate with Eleanor had traveled faster than he anticipated. The chain of loyalty he once trusted without question had gone silent, some defecting, others simply disappearing. Yet what cut the deepest was not betrayal. It was Vincent's choice. The boy he had once molded in Anthony's image, the heir to a throne built on fear, had chosen his own path. Dominic didn't need anyone to tell him what that meant. If Vincent was given time, the entire network, the laundered money, the hidden accounts, the false records, even the political alliances Dominic had crafted with surgical precision would be exposed piece by piece. Not by violence as Anthony would have done, but through something his father never possessed: legitimacy. He reached under the pillow, drew out his old pistol, and wiped the worn wooden grip with the care of habit. For a moment, his gaze drifted, unfocused, toward memories that came in broken fragments. He remembered the first time Anthony had trusted him with a cleanup, a traitor who had to be erased. He was 25 then, trembling but steady, and he hadn't hesitated to pull the trigger. Anthony had clapped his shoulder afterward. "You were born for this, Dominic." But that conviction, once a badge of honor, was now his undoing. He couldn't run, and he couldn't fight. Only one option remained to offer his final term. The next morning, Vincent received a handwritten letter, scrawled in smudged ink, as if written in a single restless sitting. In it, Dominic proposed a meeting. No guards, no weapons, no recorders. One last conversation between 2 men who had once stood on the same side of the battlefield. Gracie protested, Eleanor stayed silent, and Vincent only looked out the car window at the drifting autumn leaves before nodding. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, once the Russo's underground meat plant, now just concrete and dust. Dominic was already there when Vincent arrived. No suit, no entourage, just a hollow-eyed man who had once made an empire tremble, now nothing more than the echo of himself. Vincent entered quietly, calm but resolved. There was no hatred, only closure. Dominic stared at him for a long moment before breaking into a dry laugh. "So you really chose that road, didn't you?" Vincent didn't answer. He stepped closer, his voice low and firm. "It's not a choice, it's redemption." Dominic nodded slowly, pulling a small USB drive from his pocket. "In here," he said, lifting it between his fingers, "is everything. Off-the-book payments, disappearances, the politicians who shook our hands while pretending to clean the streets. I'm not asking for mercy. I just don't want to die knowing those bastards will keep walking free. I won't last long. But you can finish this. You have to." Vincent took the drive silently. Dominic leaned back against the cold steel column behind him, his expression unreadable. "You know," he murmured, eyes drifting toward the ceiling where hooks once hung. "Your mother started all of this, but I never hated her. She just did what we were too afraid to do." He gave a faint, broken laugh, a sound that vanished like wind slipping through a closing door. When Vincent left the warehouse, The sun was climbing above the derelict factories, bleeding pale gold into the gray. He didn't look back. He gave no order for an arrest. He knew Dominic had nowhere left to go. Days later, Dominic was found dead in that same hotel room in Brooklyn. No one could say how, and no one demanded a report. But for Vincent, the news struck like the toll of a distant bell final, echoing, irrevocable. It marked the end of an era, a dynasty, and a man. And in that ending, it also marked a beginning, a slow, painful redemption not just for Dominic, but for Vincent, for Eleanor, and for all those who had once been swallowed by the dark and were now, at last, trying to walk toward the light. On a quiet spring morning, sunlight filtered softly through the windows of a small cafe on an old street corner. As Gracie unlocked the door and stepped inside, something on the counter caught her eye, a single white rose, placed neatly beside a sealed envelope. No name, no note. No one had seen who left it there. Yet her heart stilled for a moment. There was only one person who could have left such a gift without needing to be seen. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the rose, her gaze lingering on the envelope. The scent was faint, delicate, carrying with it all the words that had never been spoken aloud. She opened the letter. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, just like the man himself. Vincent didn't write much. He spoke of gratitude, of a journey he never expected to survive, and of a mother he once thought dead but who had, in truth, never stopped living within him. He wrote that because of Gracie and because of Eleanor, he had rediscovered the human part of himself, the part long buried beneath anger, power, and shadow. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't boast of redemption. He simply wrote that he had turned over all of Dominic's files to the federal authorities, had faced the media to expose everything, and then had chosen to disappear, not out of fear, but to begin a life no longer haunted by the name Russo. The letter ended with a single line. If one day you see a stranger sitting at the familiar corner table, don't ask anything. Just bring him a strong espresso, like before, and don't forget 1 cube of sugar. Gracie smiled, a quiet smile that carried a whole world's worth of change. She placed the white rose in a small glass vase by the window, where the morning sun would touch its petals each day, a reminder that kindness, however small, can open doors no one expects. The story of Gracie, of Eleanor, of Vincent, and even of Dominic, was never merely about running from the past. It was about facing it, acknowledging it, and choosing a different road, even if late. Because sometimes, courage isn't about defying the world. It's about daring to mend what you once believed was unbreakable. If you're listening to this now, we hope their story touched something within you. Maybe you've known loss, betrayal, or the ache of losing faith in someone you once loved. Or maybe you are the one still searching for a way back to yourself. Whoever you are, remember it's never too late to begin again, to choose compassion, to love, and to forgive. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in your own life? Is there something you've long regretted but never had the chance to say? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. And if this story resonated with you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those you love. We'll continue bringing you heartfelt, human stories, small yet meaningful pieces of life, to brighten your days. Thank you for spending your time with us today. May you always have good health, peace in your heart, and joy in each new morning. Until next time.